There are moments in history, family, when the ground beneath our feet seems to tremble. Not because of fear, but because truth has finally found its voice. And across the Caribbean, across West Africa, across every corner where our people have carried the weight of silence for far too long, a new voice has risen. It is steady. It is uncompromising. It is transparent in a way many leaders have not dared to be for more than half a century. For those of you who lived through the sermons of Dr. King, who witnessed the rise of Brother Garvey's dream, who saw entire nations hoping for dignity, this moment feels familiar. It feels like a long-buried drumbeat returning to the surface. It feels like a call to stand upright again. Because when Captain Ibrahim Traoré unveiled a model of transparency that did not whisper but thundered across the region, something ancient stirred in the hearts of the people. Yet, as powerful as this awakening is, we must ask ourselves a question. Why does honesty, in its purest form, cause so many powerful figures to tremble? Before we go deeper, beloved family, make sure you subscribe so you never miss another message that speaks truth to your spirit. Family, let us walk slowly into the heart of the matter. Let us take our time, for the truth deserves a steady pace. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward with what he called a government of transparency, it was not merely an announcement. It was not a speech to be archived and forgotten. It was a spiritual rupture, a tearing of the veil that had covered corruption for far too many decades across West Africa and throughout parts of the Caribbean. The scene began quietly, almost humbly. In Ouagadougou, the young captain stood before his people with nothing more than documents, figures, contracts, and the courage to speak plainly. No theatrical display, no grand procession, no inflated promises, just clarity, clear words, clear numbers, clear intentions. In a world where many leaders still treat public information as private wealth, this simple act echoed louder than the roar of 1,000 rallies. He said, in essence, this is the nation's money, and this is how it is used. And family, those words traveled far. They traveled over dusty roads, across borders, across oceans. They traveled into the living rooms of Kingston, into the shops of Port of Spain, into the homes of Bridgetown, and into the hearts of elders who had prayed for decades to see leadership that did not hide in the shadows. But understand this: transparency, though gentle in its tone, is violent to those who thrive in the dark. And so the model Captain Traoré unveiled did not simply show numbers. It exposed habits. It exposed patterns. It exposed networks of comfort built on the backs of ordinary citizens who had grown weary of hearing excuses while struggling to find clean water, stable housing, or schools worthy of their children. The first wave of response from the people was astonishment. Many had never seen a leader open the books so boldly. Men who had worked their entire lives on sugar estates in St. Kitts looked at their screens and whispered, "Why has no one ever done this for us?" Women who had raised entire families in the inner cities of Jamaica felt a heaviness lift from their chests, a heaviness they had carried since the days when leaders promised prosperity but delivered confusion. Elders across the region recognized something ancient in this moment. They said, "This is what leadership was meant to look like. Not perfect, but honest." In churches, in barbershops, in community centers where people gathered to share news, the same sentiment rolled from tongue to tongue. This young man has returned the meaning of service. And as these discussions spread, something else emerged: fear. Not among the people, but among those who had grown accustomed to secrecy. Across several Caribbean capitals, meetings happened behind closed doors. Communications circulated discreetly. Attempts were made to discredit or dismiss the movement, for if transparency became contagious, the foundations of old political empires would begin to crack. One senior official in the region, whose name we shall respect by leaving unspoken, reportedly muttered to colleagues, "If this model takes root here, none of us will sleep comfortably again." And that, family, is the truth many citizens long suspected. Some fear honesty not because it is wrong, but because it reveals what they have kept hidden. Meanwhile, public reaction grew even more electrified. Men and women who had lost hope found themselves glued to their screens, watching every update from Burkina Faso. Young activists in Trinidad began discussing how public budgets should be displayed. Community groups in Antigua asked why their own contracts could not be shown line by line. In this wave of awakening, one phrase repeated itself over and over: "If they can show it, why can ours not do the same?" And among all these voices rose one powerful thread, one that spread through social media and community gatherings alike: the Ibrahim Traore reaction. People were no longer merely observing. They were interpreting, learning, questioning, demanding. In this shared awakening, it felt as though the region had suddenly put on new glasses and could finally see what had been blurry for too long. But let us not forget the emotional weight that settled upon the elders. Many of them felt a sharp anger, for they remembered the years when money disappeared from national budgets without explanation. They remembered broken promises of development. They remembered watching their children migrate in search of dignity. And now, seeing transparency displayed in such a pure form, they felt both pride and grief. Pride in witnessing a new dawn. Grief that the dawn had taken so long to arrive. Yet this was only the beginning, for even as the people celebrated this new clarity, a larger, more complex storm was rising behind the scenes. There were forces preparing to resist. There were networks preparing to retaliate. There were political actors who understood that if transparency continued to spread, their old methods would crumble like dust in the wind. And so, beloved family, we arrive at a turning point. The moment when an honest gesture becomes a direct threat to entrenched power. Family, let us move deeper into the storm. For every awakening in our history has been met with resistance. When a new light appears, the shadows do not surrender quietly. They twist, they thicken, they fight for survival. And that is exactly what unfolded across the region when Captain Ibrahim Traoré's clarity began to unsettle the comfortable and empower the forgotten. Across parts of the Caribbean, in Kingston, in Castries, in Nassau, murmurs began to rise in political circles. Men who had held office for decades gathered behind closed doors, their expressions stern, their voices lowered. They understood something that ordinary citizens had not yet fully grasped. Transparency was not merely a governance tool. It was a threat to the old ways. It was a mirror held up to habits that had gone unchallenged for more than half a century. The first clear sign came when a well-connected group of political advisors in the region convened a discreet emergency meeting. The subject was simple: how to contain the ripple spreading from West Africa. They feared not war, not instability, not external pressure, but truth. Truth is the one force that no security team, no spin doctor, no backroom alliance can hold back forever. Reports circulated quietly that certain leaders were unhappy with the way the public had embraced this new model. If citizens begin demanding the same level of transparency from us, one advisor reportedly warned, we will face questions none of us are prepared to answer. That single sentence traveled through political networks faster than any official communiqué. It was fear clothed in formal language. At the same time, media manipulation crept in like a slow fog. Several newspapers, stations, and commentators began sowing doubt. They questioned motivations. They exaggerated risks. They painted the transparency model as reckless, destabilizing, or naive. Even without naming anyone directly, the pattern was unmistakable. When the powerful feel cornered, they reach for narratives before they reach for truth. But family, the people were not fooled. In Trinidad, ordinary workers meeting at roadside rum shops brushed aside the accusations. In Jamaica, elders sitting on verandas whispered to one another. Do you notice they never criticized the numbers? Only the man revealing them. In Barbados, younger citizens began organizing community forums to discuss what transparent governance should look like. The awakening had begun, and there was no turning back. Then came the moment that would become known across the diaspora, the moment that forced even distant observers to acknowledge the shift. It was the Ibrahim Traore moment, the instant when the young captain publicly laid out, with absolute precision, how public money had previously been siphoned off by middlemen. He did not shout. He did not accuse individuals. He simply traced the lines, the contracts, the inflated costs, the inexplicable gaps. And family, the effect was devastating. For many citizens, it was the first time they had seen corruption illustrated not as an accusation, but as a map of loss, a map of broken promises, a map showing how opportunities had been stolen from the hands of the people. Across the Caribbean, elders felt their hearts tighten. Many remembered decades when their own leaders made grand declarations about development that never materialized. They remembered roads that were promised but never paved, schools that were planned but never built, hospitals that opened without sufficient staff. And seeing the map of misused funds from another region triggered a deep sorrow. If only we had been given this level of truth sooner. How different might our nations look today? That, beloved family, is the heart of the regret that washed over so many. It was not resentment of the young leader. It was the mourning of lost time. Meanwhile, the reaction of entrenched political groups grew increasingly tense. Some attempted to dismiss the findings. Others suggested that transparency was too costly or too risky for their own nations. A few even hinted that foreign interference might be behind the movement, as if honesty could not be homegrown. But the people were watching, and once a population learns to see, they do not easily return to blindness. Younger generations in St. Lucia, Dominica, and Grenada began sharing clips and discussions online. Across WhatsApp groups, church gatherings, and evening marketplaces, questions emerged that politicians had long avoided. Where is our budget going? Why are these contracts secret? If they can open the books, why can ours not do the same? And beneath these conversations, beneath the anger and the regret, something else was rising, a quiet sense of empowerment. People who had felt ignored for years suddenly believed their voices mattered again. Yet, as this rising consciousness spread across the region, so too did the determination of the old guard to hold their ground. Political figures who feared accountability prepared their moves carefully, knowing that the next phase of this struggle would shape the future of governance in the region. Family, let us now enter the chapter where truth begins to reshape the land itself. For every revelation carries a consequence, and when transparency is introduced into a region long accustomed to the comfort of shadows, something powerful begins to unfold. It starts quietly, softly, like the distant rumble of a drum. But soon, that rumble becomes a rhythm, and that rhythm becomes a march. When citizens across the Caribbean witnessed the clarity emerging from Burkina Faso, they did not simply applaud. They reflected, they compared, they questioned, and then, slowly but surely, they began to demand the same for themselves. In Bridgetown, community organizers gathered in church halls and public squares, inviting neighbors to talk openly about national spending. In Kingston, young university graduates began examining public documents line by line, posting their findings online with a determination that surprised even seasoned observers. In St. George's, elders who had lived through eras of political turbulence felt compelled to speak again, saying, "We have seen enough darkness in our lifetime. Give us the light while we are still here." These movements were not orchestrated by foreign actors, nor by wealthy donors, nor by hidden agendas. They were born from ordinary citizens who recognized that honesty is the most powerful inheritance a nation can offer its children. But honesty, family, has a price. As transparency gained traction among the people, discomfort grew within the political class. In several capitals, long-serving officials quietly consulted advisors, strategists, and legal experts, not because they wished to adopt the model, but because they feared what would happen if their citizens demanded it. Some began shredding old documents. Others rushed to update websites and remove evidence of years of financial mismanagement. A few attempted to redirect public attention toward international distractions, hoping the momentum would fade. Yet momentum, once set in motion by truth, is not easily stopped. Civil society groups in Trinidad began drafting proposals for publicly accessible budget dashboards. Youth activists in Jamaica shared tutorials explaining how citizens could read and interpret government contracts. A pastor in Antigua dedicated an entire sermon to the principle of righteous transparency, reminding his congregation that a nation cannot be built on secrets any more than a house can be built on sand. And as these calls grew louder, an historic shift occurred. Trust, long eroded in many Caribbean societies, began to stir again. It was fragile, like a seed pushing through dry earth, but it was real. People felt, for the first time in many years, that they had the right to expect clarity, the right to ask questions, the right to hold their leaders to account. Elders across the diaspora felt something rise in their spirits. Many said, "We thought we would never live to see this day. For decades we have prayed for leaders who serve the people and not themselves. And yet here it was, not a perfect system, not a flawless model, but a beginning, a spark." But let us also speak truthfully. Regret lingered in the air like a soft mist. Many could not help but wonder what their nations might have become if transparency had been introduced 20 or 30 or even 40 years earlier. How many communities could have been rebuilt? How many young people might have stayed home rather than searching for dignity abroad? How many hospitals, schools, and roads might have stood stronger today? This regret, however, did not crush the people. Instead, it fueled a quiet determination. For while the past could not be rewritten, the future still stood open, waiting for the courage of this generation to shape it. And so, beloved family, the question began spreading from home to home, island to island, diaspora to diaspora. If a small nation in West Africa can show its people everything, why should we accept anything less? This question transformed into a movement, a peaceful, thoughtful, persistent movement. A movement not driven by anger alone, but by longing. Longing for fairness, longing for dignity, longing for a legacy worthy of the next generation. And now, family, I pose the same question to you, for your voice matters in this unfolding story. If transparency became the standard across the Caribbean and the diaspora tomorrow, which country do you believe would transform first, and why? Share your thoughts in the comments, because your insight shapes this conversation. Yet, even as the people awakened, the world beyond the Caribbean was watching closely. Researchers, governments, and media outlets across the Atlantic and beyond began to analyze what this rising demand for honesty might mean for global politics. They understood that this was no longer a regional story. It was a signal. Family, as the Caribbean found its voice and West Africa held its ground, something remarkable happened across the wider world. Truth, once ignited in one corner of the earth, has a way of traveling faster than any ship, faster than any rumor, faster even than fear itself. And so the transparency awakening that began on African soil soon reached the desks, the boardrooms, and the institutions of nations far beyond the region. In the United States, a country with its own long and complicated history of public accountability, scholars and analysts began to examine what had unfolded. Policy researchers in Washington produced reports noting that a transparency model rooted in moral clarity rather than bureaucratic obligation was something unusual. They observed that the shift in West Africa and the reaction in the Caribbean were not mere political ripples. They were cultural tremors, deep ones. In cities such as Chicago and Atlanta, members of the African diaspora gathered in community meetings, discussing how honesty in governance might strengthen the bond between leaders and citizens on both sides of the Atlantic. Church elders spoke of the moral duty of leadership, reminding congregations that righteousness is not limited by national borders. It is a universal language understood by the human spirit. Meanwhile, in Latin America, where nations have long struggled with financial opacity and political mistrust, the transparency movement sparked renewed debates. Economists in São Paulo and Mexico City remarked that public access to financial data, if properly implemented, could become the foundation for reducing inequality. Social movements in Brazil referenced the same principles during discussions about public spending for underserved communities. Across Europe, newspapers began publishing commentary analyzing how a young African leader had triggered a public appetite for transparency that seemed to transcend geography. Some publications expressed cautious optimism. Others offered warnings, suggesting that leaders who challenge entrenched systems might face significant international pressures. But even in those warnings, one could hear a quiet admission. Honesty, once embraced by the public, is difficult to silence. International organizations also took notice. Several governance institutes highlighted the importance of citizen participation and open financial reporting. Even development agencies began revisiting their frameworks, questioning whether previous approaches had sufficiently centered the public's right to know. But perhaps the most striking global reaction came not from governments or institutions, but from ordinary people. On social media platforms across continents, videos explaining transparent budgeting gained millions of views. Educational posts created by grassroots activists were shared from Nairobi to New Orleans, from Lagos to London, from Port of Spain to Philadelphia. It was as if a long dormant hunger had been awakened. A hunger for clarity, a hunger for fairness, a hunger for leadership that treats truth not as a burden but as a duty. Family movements of this kind do not remain contained. Once a people learn to question, they cannot unlearn it. Once a society tastes honesty, it cannot be satisfied with silence. And once a culture has glimpsed the possibility of a future guided by fairness, it will not willingly return to the old road. But as the world watched and analyzed, one question grew louder, echoing from continent to continent. If this transparency movement continues to rise, what will the next stage look like? And who will shape it? Family, now we stand at the threshold of possibility. For every movement born from truth arrives at a moment when the question is no longer, what has happened? But rather, what shall we build from here? The path forward is neither guaranteed nor simple, but it is open. And openness, beloved family, is the rarest and most powerful gift a generation can inherit. Across the Caribbean, discussions have shifted from observation to preparation. Community groups in Trinidad are speaking of new oversight committees. Citizens in Barbados are sketching visions of public digital portals where every expenditure would be visible to the people. In Jamaica, young professionals have begun proposing reforms rooted not in vengeance, but in accountability and fairness. A new civic language is forming, one that blends wisdom of the elders with the determination of the youth. But this journey forward will not be free of resistance. The old guard will not simply surrender their influence. There are those who will attempt to confuse the public with false narratives, insisting that transparency is too complicated, too costly, too destabilizing. There will be efforts to divide communities, to suggest that accountability is a foreign concept rather than a moral standard. And yes, family, there may even be pressures from international actors who benefit from opaque arrangements. Yet in spite of these obstacles, the opportunity before the region is profound. With transparency as its compass, the Caribbean could strengthen its economic partnerships, consolidate regional power, and negotiate global agreements with dignity rather than desperation. The diaspora, long spread across continents, could finally see governance that reflects the values they were raised to believe in: fairness, clarity, and service to the people. In West Africa, the ripple that began with a simple commitment to honesty continues to inspire. Citizens in Ghana, Sierra Leone, and Nigeria have begun hosting community lectures on public accountability. Researchers across Africa's universities are documenting the cultural impact of transparent governance, and elders, who have witnessed countless eras of broken promises, say quietly, perhaps this is the road that leads to a different kind of future. The potential, beloved family, is larger than any one leader or nation. It is the possibility of a moral realignment, a shift in what societies demand and expect from those who hold power. It is the chance for citizens, from Bridgetown to Banjul, from Kingston to Kano, to redefine what it means to be governed with integrity. Still, the question remains: will this opening become a passageway to lasting transformation, or will it become another moment remembered with regret? The answer lies not in the hands of politicians alone, but in the will of the people, in the voices of elders, in the determination of youth, in the shared belief that truth is worth defending even when the cost is high. Family, the world watches. The diaspora watches. History watches. The future waits. Family, as we arrive at the quiet end of this journey, let us pause together and feel the weight of what has unfolded. Not only in West Africa, not only in the Caribbean, but in the hearts of people who have carried disappointment for far too long. For decades, many among our elders believed they would never again witness a leader who speaks plainly, acts boldly, and treats truth not as a threat, but as a responsibility. Yet here we stand, witnessing a shift that has awakened memories of earlier struggles, earlier hopes, earlier dreams. This movement, beloved family, is not defined by a single speech, a single reform, or a single leader. It is defined by a moral awakening, one that reminds us that justice is not a luxury and honesty is not an inconvenience. When people saw the first Ibrahim Traore moment, they were reminded that clarity can break chains just as effectively as courage. And when communities across the Caribbean discussed the Ibrahim Traore reaction, they realized that the desire for truth is not regional, but universal. Elders who had once resigned themselves to silence now find their voices stirring once again. Younger generations, raised in a world of uncertainty, now feel the possibility of a future based on fairness rather than favoritism. And across continents, from Kingston to Accra, from Bridgetown to Bamako, ordinary citizens have begun to understand that transparency is not merely a governance tool, it is a pathway to dignity. But family, the road ahead will demand vigilance. It will require patience, unity, and a willingness to question those who benefit from the shadows. And yet, the hope blooming across nations is undeniable. Every new call for accountability, every community meeting, every public discussion is another small Ibrahim Traore moment, reminding us that change is not born in palaces, but in the hearts of the people. So now I ask you, as members of this global family, do you believe transparency has the power to reshape the destiny of our nations? Not in theory, but in lived reality. Share your truth in the comments, because your perspective strengthens the collective voice. And finally, family, if this message touched something deep within you, a memory, a hope, a longing, then write. Let the light continue below, and let your voice join this rising tide for justice. And do not forget to subscribe, beloved family, because together we will keep speaking truth into the future.